I started the series talking about the sign of Jonah and asked you the question, what is the sign of Jonah? We were reading Matthew 12. And in the end, in the latter part of Matthew 12, Yeshua talks to the Pharisees and he says, I'm not going to show you any sign except the sign of Jonah. And then he talks about something greater than Jonah being here. Remember that, right? And that launched us into a conversation. What in the world is the sign of Jonah? What does it mean? What in the world is something greater? And we've talked about some of the traditional answers to those questions. The standard answer is that burial and resurrection, right? As Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, so will the Son of Man be. So everybody goes straight to the resurrection. And I kind of cast a little bit of a doubt on that. And I said, maybe he's not talking about resurrection. Maybe it's something else. And we've been thinking about the story of Jonah and what does it really mean? And what is the something greater? And so for those of you who weren't here, I pointed out that it actually does mean something greater. In Greek, it's a neuter gender, and it's a little bit of a problem that everybody tries to say that something greater is Yeshua, because he's definitely not something. He's definitely someone. And this is where things don't correlate. And then I showed you that the something right there, right next in a sentence, is actually a quote from Hosea chapter 6, where God says, I desire chesed, mercy. And in Greek, that word helios is neuter. So it is actually something greater. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. That is the something greater. So I've been leading you on this long, long chase. To chase now through the whole entire Matthew 12, what is something greater? And what is this sign of Jonah? Those are two questions that we have been asking now for a while. But I told you that the only way we're going to really understand what they truly mean if we dive into the context of the entire chapter. Because as you go to the very beginning of chapter 12 of Matthew, it does talk about something greater. In another passage, okay? The Lord of the Sabbath passage. Remember that? Okay? The disciples pass through the field, they start grabbing some grain, they're eating it, they get criticized, okay? And then Yeshua answers that if you only knew, if you only understood what this verse means, okay? I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And there's that chesed idea, right? You would not condemn my disciples. And so then he talks about the Son of Man being the Lord of the Sabbath. And I ask you the same questions. Once again, I asked, who is the Lord of the Sabbath? What in the world does that mean? And who is the Son of Man? And of course, the standard answers usually are that the Son of Man is Messiah, okay? That he's talked about himself. And of course, he is the Lord of the Sabbath, and therefore the disciples can do whatever the heck they want, because Sabbath and no Sabbath, the Lord of the Sabbath is here. And he says, it's okay. That's the standard answer pretty much. In most commentaries, if you pull them off right now on the shelf, that's what you're going to hear. So I kind of also asked you some questions. Well, you know, what if? And we talked about the idea of Ben Adam, okay, and Bab Enosh, and how these terms are being used in Aramaic and in Hebrew, and what they actually signified. And I showed you a parallel passage in the book of Mark, where Mark actually flat out interprets Yeshua's words. And he tells you that mankind is the Lord of the Sabbath. That the Sabbath was made for mankind and not mankind for the Sabbath. So the earliest interpreter of Yeshua himself is Mark. This is the Gospel of Mark. And we discussed this whole idea of subordination. That in Yeshua's thinking, in his teaching, in his values, there is a priority of things. Okay? There's the temple. Then there's the Sabbath. And whenever Sabbath needs to be broken, the priests do break the Sabbath. They do things that are forbidden on the Sabbath to do in the temple. Why? Because the temple is more important. So you got Sabbath, temple, more important, and then he says there's something out there above it, something greater. And I suggested that something greater is chesed, God's mercy. And that's why he says it's okay for my disciples to pick up a few handfuls of grain and eat them. And we talked a little bit about all the different implications of that. So I'm leading you on the long string of trying to understand actually a quite complicated teaching that unfolds not just in one verse, not in two verses, but in a whole entire chapter. And so that's why it's taken us weeks to travel this through. But if I can keep you focused, on answering these questions, I think we'll be able to unravel this whole idea of what in the world is the sign of Jonah, and why is Yeshua talking about it, and what is the point, essentially, of what he says. So then, of course, the next passage was the doing good on the Sabbath. This is the healing of the man in the synagogue, where a man is brought before Yeshua, and he basically decides to heal him, and he gets criticized for healing him. Why? Because you're not supposed to practice, your doctor skills on Shabbat, but here, he heals him. And then he asks the question, is it okay to do good on Shabbat? If your sheep falls in, and you're not going to pull it out? And of course, we talked about that. That was the halakha of the day. It was norm for Pharisees to believe that a sheep should be pulled out. And I showed you how not all Jews actually shared that idea. I showed you a few places where Jews said, no, you don't do that. You actually wait. So the story continues, and at that point, Matthew decides to quote from Isaiah. And he quotes one of the famous songs of the servant. Okay, my servant. If you haven't read Isaiah, there are 4 songs of the servant. He keeps calling them my servant, my servant. They're beautiful, they're poetic, they're a little bit hard to unravel. And sometimes they're clearly about Israel, and at other times, to me, they're clearly not about Israel. Like, for example, the servant in Isaiah 53 can't possibly be Israel because the servant dies for the sins of my people. And if my people is Israel, then that's kind of a problem. So this identity of the servant keeps jumping back and forth between Israel and what I believe is the Messiah, right? So we went through that passage and we looked on some of the common themes, like why in the world does Matthew bring in this passage about the servant here right now? What does it have to do with anything? And one of the features that perhaps you remember seeing is that what Messiah brings, what the servant brings, is he brings judgment to the nation, or as it says, justice. The word is mishpat in Hebrew. And that is essentially liberation from idolatry. God says, I will not share my glory with idols anymore. And that is the work of the Messiah, is to basically bring out justice, bring out judgment, clarify these things to the point where people are no longer worshiping idols and not bound to them, because God says, I'm not sharing my glory anymore. And that's kind of the punchline of that passage. And we actually read Matthew's quote, but then we went into Isaiah and looked at the original too, just to make sure we're tracking along. So that was the idea. Mercy, judgment, idolatry. All these topics are connected in the Isaiah quote that we read. So what we stopped at is this idea that mishpat, judgment, as Isaiah defines it, is not necessarily chesed. It's not the same thing as mercy, because we've been talking about mercy, chesed. But giving people an ability to judge or to reason, okay, because this is what mishpat means. If you think about that Hebrew word, if you go look it up in a dictionary, pull up a dictionary off the shelf right there, and look up word mishpat, you'll see we'll give you several options of how to translate it. Sometimes it translates as judgment, sometimes it translates as justice, sometimes it translates even as a sentence, like the sentence that the judge orders. Right? But in the end, a lot of times it has to do with reasoning. And so some of God's commandments are actually called mishpatim, right? Because these are the ordinances, these are the rulings that God made. These are his judgments. And we are to know them, we're to live by them. So these are God's judgments, essentially. And so showing that idols are not in charge leads people to what? To freedom, to liberty, to realize that they were in bondage to something that's not God. Why would they want to be? So that's the work of the Messiah. That's what the servant does. And I think that's why Matthew quotes that passage from Isaiah. It's the work of Messiah, God's mercy, restoration, tikkun olam, the ridding world of idolatry. There's one God. Here's the light. We're going to shine it. Come to the light. The temple becomes the center of this activity. And so the prophets essentially equated the work of Messiah with ridding the world of idolatry. That's one of the greatest expectations that the prophets had in Messiah. So something greater and a blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. Let's read this passage to kind of guide us. And they brought to him a demoniac who was blind and mute. And he cured him, so that the one who had been mute could speak and see. And all the crowds were amazed and said, can this be son of David? But when the Pharisees heard it, they said, it is only by Beelzebul, the ruler of demons, that this fellow casts out demons. You heard this one, right? What happens here in this story, obviously we have a person who is somehow afflicted by this demon. And a miracle happens. And a miracle is not recognized. In fact, the miracle is denied. So what are demons? And why do they afflict people? This is a question that we modern people have to ask because we modern people usually have a problem with that. Because we're very scientific. We're told all sorts of things in life. And we're told that this world beyond this world that we can feel and touch and sneeze at doesn't really exist, right? So what is all this? What are demons? Well, for first century Jews, I don't know what they are for you, but for first century Jews, demons, the Greek term was daimonion, is another word for a foreign god. I don't know if you realize this or not. The Greek writings basically speak all the time of their gods as daimonia. And that is a word that has now traveled into Western culture and Western languages, and we understand demons a little bit differently, right? See, the reality is that we are modern people living in our modern world. No, I wouldn't say polluted, but our minds are filled with ideas that are modern. We can't unknow what we know. We can't unthink what we have been thinking. And I'm trying to push you out into thinking like ancient people, because if you want to understand an ancient text, you're going to have to learn to think like they do. And that means you might have to take some of the ideas that you have, and you might have to bracket them, because guess what? Those ideas haven't yet appeared on the history of human development. So Psalm 96 in the Hebrew says, "For great is the Lord, okay, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, and greatly to be praised. He is to be feared above all gods." The word is Elohim, right? Elohim is a plural word. It means God as a singular, and also means gods as a plural. In this case, he is to be feared above all gods. So it's definitely plural. It says, "For all gods, Elohim, of the peoples," he says they are Elilim. Elilim literally means nothings. They're nothing. But the Lord, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, he made the heavens. Now this is psalm, it's praise, right? What I want you to see is how these words are being used. You have God who is God, and you have other gods. And the other gods are nothings, essentially. So when this same psalm is being translated in Septuagint, and it actually becomes Psalm 95 there, but Septuagint translates Hebrew now into Greek, and this is the Jews of 150 years before Yeshua. And they're saying, when they translate it, the same passage, the gods, theoi, plural of theos, of the nations are demons. That's what it actually says. Daimonia. So we're Elilim, we get daimonia. But the Lord, he made the heavens.
They're splitting the one word off into two.
You got it. They are moving into direction of giving us the concepts that eventually will become how we understand them. But the gods are daimonia. They're demons. Same exact psalm. We just go from Hebrew into Greek. And so here's another one. Deuteronomy 32:17. And this is in Jewish Greek. And I want you to understand that when we read Brit Chadashah, when we read the New Testament, what we're reading is Jewish Greek. That means this is Greek, but this is Greek spoken by Jews, because colloquially they're Jews, they're thinking half and half, they're multilingual people, and they're kind of bringing all these concepts from all over the place. So in Jewish Greek, demon is basically saying a lesser god. That's really what they're saying. So in Septuagint, in Deuteronomy, Moses says that those who make a golden calf, okay, and this is right there in Deuteronomy 32, sacrifice to demons, okay? Demonoisis, this is, they sacrifice to demons, not to God, not to Theos. Theos is God, right? But to demons. And they worship gods, in plural, in Greek, Theos. They had not known. So you can see there's this new language that comes in now. After the exile, this terminology starts to rise up. Why? Because the exile was over what? Over not being faithful to God, over worshiping idols, things that are not God. So now after the exile, we're going to make sure that there's nobody in our midst that's going to even think that this is somehow acceptable and doable. So we have a cultural shift in Jewish life. And essentially Judaism becomes a culture that defeats its own greatest enemy, idol worship. Most Jews do not become idol worshipers after the Babylonian captivity. There's still that threat always looming there, but it was a lot more before. After captivity, it kind of gets settled. I just want you to see the trajectory of the language. So if we're going to read first century text, and we want to understand it on the terminology that they use, we've got to enter into their world a little bit. And that's what I'm doing. That's how I'm taking you there. So I have some questions. So this healing that we just read about, Yeshua is proclaimed the Son of David. Some people see him heal this person, right? And they call him Son of David, Ben David. Why in the world why does that miracle prove that he's the Son of David? Maybe you heard some ideas. Another question I have is, what is so amazing about this demonized person who was mute and blind and yet he was healed? Demonized persons are demonized persons. What's amazing? Why is that miracle all of a sudden makes them so amazed? And then why was Yeshua accused of driving demons by the power of Beelzebul? Who in the world is this ruler of demons, and why does he have anything to do with this? These are the questions that naturally pop up in my mind when I read this passage. And I'm going to answer them for you, essentially, through the next few slides. And some of the places I'll take you, I think you'll be very, very intrigued. First of all, today, most people, when they hear the Son of David, Ben David, automatically go to, this is the reference of Messiah. I mean, is that not where your mind goes?
Yes.
Well, I want you to realize that this terminology was also not solidified at that time yet. Although that was a reference to Messiah, it was also a reference to another person, a very famous person, the son of David, the King Solomon, who is quite literally Ben David. He is actually the son of David. So King Solomon, what does King Solomon have anything to do with this? Well, remember, in the end of that chapter, Yeshua actually says something greater than Solomon is here. So trust me, he is in the mix. And I'm going to show you how. Because in ancient lore, in ancient Jewish lore, King Solomon was known for his knowledge of how to deal with unclean spirits. Some Hellenistic and some Gnostic texts that we found in Egypt mention the Book of Solomon that contained methods and cures and formulas. Solomon's name was sometimes even inscribed on the amulets that were designed to ward off demons and demonic activity. I want you to realize that when you said to an ancient person Solomon's name, they immediately thought of a person who had mastery over unclean spirits and demons. What I'm trying to say, there's a whole bunch of lore like this that you may not be familiar with. And I realize that. That's okay, because we're living in this world and we have a whole new lore sometimes that's familiar to us. But the ancient stories that people told about casting out demons is not something that, we are always privy to. And I'm kind of bringing this on to you as saying this is what ancient people thought when they thought about the Son of David and when they thought about Solomon and demon possessions and things like that. So here's a Wisdom of Solomon. This is a book that's actually in some Bibles, not in the Protestant Bible, but it's an apocryphal book. So the Catholic Bible, if you look that up, it's there. And this is the passage that talks about Solomon and his wisdom. I'm going to read this really quickly. It says, this is Solomon's words, so supposedly. May God grant me to speak with judgment and to have thoughts worthy that I have received. For it is he who gave me uttering knowledge of what exists, to know the structure of the world and the activity of the elements, the beginning and the end of middle times, and alterations of solstices and changes of seasons, the cycles of the year and the constellations of the stars. And you hear, that's not just wisdom and understanding of the Bible. We're talking about how everything works. All right, let's keep going. The natures of animals and tempers of wild animals, the powers of spirits and thoughts of human beings, the varieties of plants and the virtues of roots. I learned both what is secret and what is manifest. For wisdom is the fashioner of all things taught me. So this is Solomon, supposedly, telling us that there's all sorts of things that God endowed him with when he prayed for wisdom. And some of those things that he understood were quite encompassing. One of them would be powers of the spirits, okay? So this is that word ruach, which can, or pneuma in Greek. This is the word that can mean a spirit, it can mean a wind, it can mean a breath. We've already talked about it. Sometimes things translate all across the place. So that's an interesting quote from Wisdom of Solomon. That's a 1st century BCE book. Okay, 1st century BCE. So that predates the New Testament here for you. So basically, to recap, the ancient Jewish exorcisms usually included learning the evil spirit's name and then rebuking and threatening that demon by name. Addressing the demon by name was really important. This is why Yeshua once asked the demon, "What is your name?" Remember? And he says, "Oh, actually, we're many." I'm just not too long here. I've moved into this place, and there's a whole bunch of us sharing this apartment. So you get the idea. So this is in Mark 5. This is in Luke 8. So in this story, the person could not speak. Could not see and could not speak. So think about it now. What's making it remarkable? He can't even conversate with this demon who is afflicting this person. There's not, that conduit speech is not going to happen. So here's a passage from Josephus, just to kind of play on this. Josephus tells all kinds of stories, and this is one of them that he's relating. He says, I have seen a certain man of my own country, in other words, another Jew, whose name was Eliezer, releasing people that were demoniacal, or demonical, so it's just archaic English. It says, he put a ring that had a root on one of the sorts that mentioned by Solomon through the nostrils of the demoniac. So he had a ring with roots inside it, and he made that person smell it. After which he drew out the demon through the nostrils. And when the man fell down immediately, he abjured him and returned him to return into him no more, making still mention of Solomon and reciting incantations which he composed. So what's interesting to you? Remember, Josephus is a first century Jew. He dies at the turn of the century, essentially, at the very, very end of the first century. And so, according to Josephus, and in his thinking, first of all, this activity was real. There were people who were casting out demons, and it was done through smell, through making them smell things. Apparently, demons could be driven out by certain smells that were not good for them. And certainly Solomon had the recipes. So this guy is completely 100% convinced that Solomon is helping out somehow. That Solomon, remember, he has a book. He's written this book, and he has these incantations, these words, these recipes of how to deal with these, essentially, creatures that plague us. So this is a first century person. This is their thinking. This is what we're trying to capture. And that starts to make sense a little bit, because what I want you to realize is that the ancient exorcisms, they often involve special formulaic phrases and names. I'm going to remind you the incident in Ephesus in Acts 19. How many of you remember what happened in Acts 19? Right, the seven sons.
Jonah, they decide to cast out some spirits and decide to use Yeshua's name.
And they decide to use Apostle Paul's name, if you remember. So the seven sons. And it doesn't turn out so well for them, right? But there is such thing as Jewish exorcists at that time. And it says that when people in Ephesus actually saw the apostle cast out those demons, that they took all of their magic books and they burned them all. So they were booked. And just read that just for fun, just to give you a little bit of a context. So we have books, we have incantations, we have words, we have names that are being used to somehow make those spirits leave. Right? We have a very consistent practice here. And so then the burning of herbs and special roots was another practice that people used, because apparently certain smells affected demons. So in the book of Tobit, I don't know if anyone remembers the story, there's an evil demon, Asmodeus, there, who afflicts one of the heroes of the story, and he's cast out by burning fish entrails. And very particular, the angel comes and says, I know how to get rid of him. This is what we do. You go catch this particular fish, and you take the guts of the fish, and you burn them, and the demon will have to flee. So that's the story of Tobit. You can read it. And so then, of course, that particular wicked demon is bound, and angel helps Tobit out big time in the story. But I want you to see that these are old practices. Now, Tobit is a 2nd century BCE book. Okay, just in case you're wondering. So this is hundreds of years before the New Testament. So neither one of these things are taking place here in this particular situation, where Yeshua is being brought to this man who cannot speak, he could not see, and he just casts him out. He just heals the man, essentially. And so this is remarkable. Okay, this is unusual. He's not speaking to this demon. He's not addressing this spirit by name. He just gets him out. So why in the world is Yeshua accused of driving out this spirit by Beelzebub? What in the world does Beelzebub have anything to do with that? Why Beelzebub? Why not some other name? Why not some other spirit or god or deity or something like that? Why are they doing that? Well, there's a reason. And there's a very specific reason and a very concrete reason. And again, it goes back to the Jewish lore that existed in that time, in that era, that most people are not familiar with. So what does Beelzebub have to do with all this? First of all, Beelzebul is a Canaanite deity. There's a little bit of a difference. There's two spellings. Beelzebul, is one of them. Baal means master, Zebul means exalted or high. Okay, in 1 Kings, in chapter 1, we have the king of Israel who asks to inquire of Beelzebul of Ekron if he will recover. He's sick. And so he says, will I recover? Go and inquire of this particular deity, Beelzebul of Ekron. And so then Elijah comes to him and he says, well, now you're for sure not going to recover. Why? Because you're seeking help from a God who's not your God, who's not Israel's God. You're going to inquire of a foreign God if you're going to get better? So he says, well, now forget it. So this is the story. This is how I want you to see that now Beelzebul is a foreign god. He's a Canaanite deity. And that's the historical remark here. Now, in ancient Jewish thought, demons and unclean and malevolent spirits and foreign gods were worshipped by the nations. That's what the nations worshipped. Understand this. So logically, Beelzebul or Beelzebub is a local chief god demon. That's what he is. Call him whatever you want. Call him a god, call him a demon. That's the language, depending on whether you're going to go for Hebrew or Greek. And there's a direct connection between King Solomon and Beelzebub in ancient Jewish lore. And that connection is seen in a book called Testament of Solomon. Most people have not read the Testament of Solomon. I have quoted sometimes when I was teaching here from the Testament of Solomon, occasionally because the whole entire book is actually about Solomon dealing with demons. Okay, so the Testament of Solomon. Let me tell you just a couple of words about this book. The Testament of Solomon is a very interesting book. The scholars have found this probably 1700s, 1800s. They got a hold of this manuscript, and they've been kicking around trying to figure out what it is. It's in Greek. They believe that it might have been in Hebrew earlier on, but they don't have anything like that. They just have Greek. And they tried to figure out when it was written. And the first assumption was that it comes from the Middle Ages, because the idea of demonology and angelology was very developed in the Middle Ages. In fact, most of the things that people believe today about demons and angels comes not from antiquity. It comes from the Middle Ages. And so they thought that this is where it's from. But then they started finding references to that book in other ancient texts. And the further they dug, the further they realized that the Testament of Solomon, and it actually would quote it. It would quote little bits and pieces of that text when it would talk about it. The book that Solomon wrote, and it will do a little quote. And so when they found it, they started saying, wait a minute, this is much more ancient. This is what has been so far determined. The book belongs to anywhere from 1st century of Common Era to the 3rd century of Common Era. So that means that it overlaps somewhere between the time of the New Testament and up to the time of Mishnah and the Talmud is being written. So that's the historical bracket. They believe that the Book of Solomon originated with it. No, it was not written by King Solomon, because we know King Solomon lived way back. But it's a story about him, and it is a Jewish story about him. And at whatever that book relates to us, it doesn't even matter if it's true or not true. What we care in that book is, what did the people of the 1st century believe? Because they would find that book absolutely fascinating and completely true, because they had no reason to believe it. They didn't have scientific theory like we do today. Remember, we're children of the Enlightenment era. We think differently. They did not think that way. They did not have this healthy skepticism where they're going to question everything. They just said, oh, this is a book about Solomon. It must be good. I'm going to start reading it. And that's how they would have taken it. So there was a lot of lore that has been accepted and taken in by people without any question whatsoever. And that becomes a part of common culture. And this is what the Testament of Solomon really is. So now that you know a little bit of what it is, and I told you, I'm going to read a little bit of quotes from there and see what will make sense for you. It says, when I, Solomon, heard these things, and Solomon is perplexed over here. In the story, he's building a temple, and one of the workers of the temple is being afflicted by the demon. And he does not know how to get rid of this demon. This is one of his best craftsmen. And he decides to help. So he says, when I heard these things, I went into the temple of God. He's not standing yet, it's kind of partially built. And praising him day and night, and I begged with all my soul that the demon might be delivered into my hands, that I might have authority over him. Then it happened that while I was praying to the God of heaven and earth, there was granted to me from the Lord Sabaoth, through the archangel Michael, a ring which had a seal engraved on precious stone. He said to me, Solomon, son of David, take the gift which the Lord God, the highest Sabaoth, has sent you. With it you shall imprison all the demons, both the female and male, and with their help you shall build Jerusalem when you bear the seal of God. Now that's the setup for the story. So you've already heard James mention that there's a lore in Jewish tradition in the Talmud that Solomon actually used some very powerful beings to help him build the temple. And this is where it comes from, because these stories, even if they were not written down at that point, they were already told as stories and legends. A lot of times these things existed in oral form way before they were written down. So this is the setup. So he gives them a ring. The angel gives them a ring, and with this ring he's going to imprison all the demonic powers. That's the setup. Now, let's keep reading. Testament of Solomon. This is the second, third chapter. It says, I, Solomon, got up from my throne, and I saw the demon shuddering and trembling with fear. So finally, he gets this demon that's been afflicting this craftsman. And so now he's scared because Solomon has the ring. This is the ring of power. Okay, kind of like Tolkien idea, right? Yeah, this one ring. So now you have to realize, none of this lore is isolated. Some of the greatest people who know these things play on these things in their literary works as well. So one ring to bind them all, right? So if you guys are Tolkien fans, then you totally are having fun right now with this. But so he's sitting in his throne, and now he's got this demon in front of him, cowering. He says, I got up from my throne and saw a demon shuddering and trembling with fear. I said to him, who are you? What is your name? And the demon replied, I am called Orneas. I am descended from Archangel, the power of God, but I am thwarted by Uriel, the Archangel. After I sealed the demon with my seal, I ordered him into the stone quarry to cut for the temple stones. I prayed that the Archangel Uriel would come to help me. Immediately I saw the Archangel Uriel descending to me from heaven. I commanded Orneas to come near according to his fate. Then I gave him the seal and said, go and bring here to me the prince of demons. So Orneas took the ring and went to Beelzebul and said to him, come, Solomon summons you. He followed, meaning Orneas, under coercion and came to me. When I saw the prince of demons approaching, I glorified God and I said, blessed are you, Lord God Almighty, who has granted your servant Solomon wisdom and attended your thrones, and who has placed in subjection all the power of demons. So now Solomon has this ring, and this ring he gives to another demon, and that demon brings to him Beelzebul. Now remember, I asked you, what in the world does Beelzebul have to do with that story? Now you understand, because what's going to happen next is Solomon is going to use the chief of demons, the prince of demons. He's going to use Beelzebul because he's the guy in charge. He's going to use him to come up and bring up all of his underlings. Now this whole network of demons is going to be unraveled, and that's what the rest of the book of Solomon is all about dealing with them, and he basically makes them do work for him. Essentially, he subdues them, he makes them do work for him, and that's what the story is about. So, but how he does it is through the power of Beelzebul, because he's the boss, and he has all these underlings. And so once you get the boss, you get all the other people to fall in line. And that's how the story goes. So you may chuckle at this, you may laugh, but this is the Testament of Solomon. And I believe this is some of the lore that stands behind some of these stories that we're reading. So do you read this passage now completely different when you get to it? I do. So here's another one. It says, I interrogated him. So now he's interrogating Beelzebul. I interrogated him, and he said to me, tell me, who are you? The demon said, I am Beelzebul, the ruler of the demons. I demanded that without interruption, he sit next to me and explain the manifestations of the demons. Then he promised to bring to me all of the unclean spirits bound Again, I glorified the God of heaven and earth, continually giving thanks to him. I commanded another demon be brought to me, and he, Beelzebul, brought to me the evil devil Asmodeus, bound. Here's that demon from the book of Tobit that we know about. I asked him, who are you? He scowled at me. Do not ask me so many things, Solomon, for eventually your kingdom will be divided. Oh, he knows the Bible too. The glory of yours is temporary. You have us to torture for a little while, then we shall disperse among human beings, and again with the result that we shall be worshipped as gods, because men do not know the names of the angels who rule over us. When I, Solomon, heard these things, I bound him with greater care. I asked him again, saying, do not hide anything from me, for I am Solomon, son of David. I am giving you guys a little bit of the background, a little bit of context. I don't know that the writers of the New Testament necessarily had the Testament of Solomon in their hand, but I know they heard the stories. I know they must have heard these tales, because now that I see this book, now that I read this passage about Yeshua interacting with these people and him being challenged that he does it by the power of Beelzebul and calling him the king of, calling him son of David in a completely different light. So let's look at this passage again. They brought to him a demoniac who was blind and mute, and he cured him. By the way, he cured him. Do you notice? It says healed, actually. The New Revised Standard Version says he cured him. It says he healed him. So the one who had been mute could speak and see, and all the crowds were amazed and said, can this be the son of David? Look how easily he took care of that one. Essentially, yeah? But when the Pharisees heard it, they said, it is only by Beelzebul, the ruler of the demons, that this fellow casts out demons. And then, of course, you know the rest. Yeshua starts into his answer. And he's not going to be allowing people to say that, oh no, this is by the power of demons. So he actually goes to answer. He says, he knew what they were thinking, and said to them, every kingdom divided against itself is laid to waste, and no city or house divided against itself will stand. If Satan casts out Satan, he's divided against himself. And how will his kingdom stand? If I cast out demons by Beelzebul, by whom do your own exorcists cast them out? Therefore, they will be your judges. Now, do you understand why he answers the way he answers? Divided kingdom, the idea, if I do this through demonic power, then it makes no sense. Although, we know about this, and we know the whole tradition and lore about Solomon. We know about casting out demons and basically having demons come before you and do whatever they need to do, because who you have in your hands is Beelzebul. So he says, okay, if I do it this way, then what about your students who are going out and casting out demons? Do they not use the same names? Do they not fall back on the same phrases, the same words, same incantations, same methods, same ideas? Except he doesn't use any of those things there. You see, this is now becoming kind of this little bit of a competition, a little bit of a contention, and they try to stick it to him, and he sticks it right back to them.